Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Arab Invasion of France, Battle of Toulouse by Kings and Generals. This is the newest episode in their early Muslim expansion series. Last time we saw the failed siege of Constantinople and the overextension of the Umayyad Caliphate. In this episode, I imagine we will continue to see the Umayyads struggle to control their own territory, and it looks like we'll be heading back to Western Europe. But before we get to that, I would very much appreciate it if you guys would check out my Patreon. It is linked down below, and it will give you access to exclusive reaction content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this video.
In the previous video, the short reign of the paranoid Caliph Suleiman saw a massive invasion of Constantinople end in catastrophic failure, and the deaths of many of the great generals and conquerors that had expanded the Umayyad Caliphate to its greatest extent during the reign of his predecessors.
Yep.
In this video,
we have really seen the rapid expansion of the Umayyad Caliphate, and it now appears to be rapidly crumbling. As they pointed out, many of those who contributed to that expansion are now going, many times due to power struggles within the ranks of the Caliphate.
Of Yazid II brings further setbacks and fragmentation as the weakened Umayyad Caliphate stumbles through its final years. This video was kindly sponsored by our YouTube members and patrons. Right now, the patrons and YouTube members are exclusively watching our first Punic War and Pacific War series, while the series on the history of Prussia and Italian unification wars, Risorgimento, have been concluded, and the series on the Russo-Japanese War and the Albigensian Crusade and Xenophons and Abbasids will be released next. You can join their ranks via the links in the description.
So much content!
To get exclusive videos, early access to all public videos, see our schedule, get access to a special Discord server where we are very active, and much more. Thanks for supporting us. We couldn't be doing it without your help.
So much content, and go and check that out, and I extend the same offer to you guys. First of all, thank you for the support. Second of all, hey, you can check out YouTube channel memberships, the Patreon. You will get access to exclusive content. You will get access to an exclusive channel in the Discord, sort of similar offerings. So hey, if you're interested, go and check that out down below.
Following Suleiman's death and the end of his disastrous period as Caliph in 717, the Caliphate was granted a brief reprieve from its troubles through the mostly peaceful and uneventful 3-year reign of Ahmad II.
Nice.
Despite a small Iraqi Kharijite rebellion in 718 seeing some initial success against local forces, Syrian troops swiftly put it down under Ahmad's cousin Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik, and the frontiers remained mostly quiet during Ahmad's brief reign, and the attempted political and social reforms he championed. As seen in previous episodes, numerous revolts against the Caliphate had come about due to the poor treatment of non-Arab converts to Islam.
Right, and this is an issue, and it's an issue that we've seen plenty throughout this series, because the whole idea is that you convert to Islam, and then, we're all equal, or we should all be equal. We're all Muslims here. It should not matter what our ethnicity is or any other distinctions. But that has not been the case. From the beginning, Arab Muslims have gotten favorable treatment, and Muslim converts from other backgrounds, although at this point, I'm sure these other peoples have been Muslims for a long time, they haven't gotten that equal treatment. They've been treated as second-class citizens, and so understandably that has caused a lot of unrest, uprisings, civil strife, all that sort of stuff, because they feel, rightfully so, that they should be treated equally. I mean, that is sort of the whole idea, right?
Or Mawali. Rebellion among Persian-speaking Iraqis had threatened to topple the Umayyad dynasty twice, under Mukhtar al-Thaqafi during...
A lot of this especially circles around that sort of Persian zone of culture, not Persians specifically, right? There are a lot of different ethnic groups, and a lot of different ethnic groups that were once under the Persian Empire, which has now fallen, but a lot of that Persian identity, culture, language still survives, and it is something that brings people together even while they're in the caliphate. And so you can see how that might start to create some divisions. Like, sure, And, they're sort of fighting to be seen equally as Muslims, but even under the guise of the Caliphate, which has this sort of primarily religious identity, people still hold on to a certain extent to other types of identities. They still hold on to their customs, their old way of doing things, and so something like language or culture or whatever can hold particular groups of people together and can also create problems in this circumstance.
During the Second Fitna and Ibn al-Ash'ath in 700 AD, and Iberia was plagued by ongoing strife between its Berber and Arab conquerors. Umar made efforts to address this problem, making all Muslims exempt from the Jizzy Attacks rather than Arabs only, which, coupled with expanded missionary activity to encourage conversion in his still minority Muslim empire, brought some—
Wow, still minority Muslim empire. That's pretty remarkable. And it reminds you how quickly this empire has expanded, that they have a whole lot of different people within this empire and a whole lot of non-Muslims. Of course, they've got Christians, Jews, but also people from a variety of religious backgrounds. I mean, talk about the Jizzy Attacks. That is a tax that, after this, is applied to non-Muslims, but not to Muslims. And they said, he sort of restricted that further so that all Muslims didn't have to pay that, not just Arab Muslims. You can see why that might have been a problem beforehand. But we're still dealing with an empire with a very large non-Muslim population.
Some degree of improved cohesion and stability at the cost of cutting into the Caliphate's tax revenues. However, several events during his reign would have long-term repercussions.
Okay.
First, the Caliphate met its limit on its far eastern frontiers, where the Arab holdings in Transoxiana became the battleground against a new rival in the form of Tang China.
Yeah.
The Caliphate—
And we've done a reaction to that before. I still think it's truly remarkable, and it shows you how far both the Caliphate and China during this era extended, that these two would even meet. I mean, China has to come very far westwards, and the Caliphate has to extend very far eastwards for these two to meet in the middle, but they did, and they came into conflict. What a thing to think about.
Its holdings in the region were recent conquests brought about by Qutayba ibn Muslim, who had since been a victim of Suleiman's purges, leaving the distant frontier bereft of this popular and skillful leader. Thus, when the Arabs were drawn into an ongoing conflict between the Tang and the Tibetan Empire as a Tibetan ally, it would soon spell disaster. The caliphal vassal Khan Suluk of the Turgesh's invasion of the Tarim Basin would meet staunch opposition from Ashinashan, a leader amongst the Western Turkic Khaganate and a commander of the so-called Protectorate General to pacify the West. Despite both the Arabs and Tibetans sending significant reinforcements for this offensive push, and holding a numerical advantage, the mostly Turkic Tang-aligned force opposing them would win a decisive victory, breaking the siege of Aksu, while another Chinese force simultaneously defeated the Tibetans along the Yellow River, assuring Chinese dominance in the region for the next few decades.
Yeah, and like they said, we are now reaching sort of the easternmost extent of the Caliphate. And to be fair, that is an extremely impressive easternmost extent, but you also have to think, and this is sort of a broader point, as the Caliphate expands in terms of power, territory, Islam expands alongside it. Its influence spreads the religion, and of course the religion will spread far beyond the borders of the Caliphate, and so when it starts getting this far eastwards, it sort of comes to a stop. But of course Islam will continue to spread even beyond the Caliphate, spread eastwards, spread in a lot of different directions, so it sort of makes you think about that religious and cultural influence.
Suluk, for his part, promptly switched to the winning side and swore fealty to the Tang after his defeat at Aksu, even going on to attack his former overlords in Fergana, a poorly defended region. There was little support from the Caliphate's core to be found on the frontiers, for reasons we will soon cover.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much they can even afford to send support that far eastwards. They've got bigger issues to worry about.
However, this period did see success in Al-Andalus, where Governor Al-Sam ibn Malik had managed to bring most of the Arab-Berber infighting under control, allowing him to
And now, they've pushed all the way through the Iberian Peninsula. Now modern-day Spain and Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula is under Muslim control. Now they start to push into France even further. We've covered that a little bit on this channel before, but once again, we are seeing the extent of the caliphate, how truly massive it was.
Capture such major holdouts as Barcelona and Narbonne from the Visigothic remnant under King Ardo in 719, with the aid of Syrian and Yemeni new arrivals. With the minting of the first Arab coins in Iberia, marking their gradual transformation from a mere occupying army to the vibrant hybrid civilization Al-Andalus would later become.
Yeah.
Closer to home, the rapid...
And we talk about the sort of furthest extent to the east, but one of the differences when we look at the Muslim rule over Iberia, Al-Andalus, is that it will last for a while, and there will be this mixing of cultures, and, after a certain amount of time, things sort of start to sink in, and you have this sort of civilization developing. Of course, they eventually get pushed out by the Christians, but some of those cultural legacies remain today, some of the architecture, the practices, that sort of thing, so that's really fascinating.
Succession of caliphs was creating its own problems. Among them, the arrest and later escape of Yazid ibn al-Mahalab, formerly governor of Iraq under Suleiman, and the leader of the ambitious and increasingly powerful Mahalabid family. Over the previous decades, the prestigious position of governor of Iraq had come to hold power almost rivaling that of the caliph himself, given its traditional oversight over all of the caliph's eastern provinces, making the stance of Iraq's governor a major factor in any thorny or contested caliphal succession, such as those of Suleiman and Umar. Umar and Ibn al-Mahalib had bad blood between them already when Umar took the throne, and the governor knew he only had worse problems ahead should Umar be succeeded as caliph by Yazid ibn Abd al-Malik, whose in-laws from the family of the renowned former governor al-Hajjaj had been tortured and executed on Ibn al-Mahalab's orders during a previous political power struggle.
Oh man, it's getting messy. It's been messy, but it's getting messy. We're dealing with such typical empire problems. As you expand, certain provinces gain more power, certain positions, governorships in this case, gain a lot of authority, and then that starts to threaten your position as caliph or emperor or whatever position you're talking about in that case, and really, if we're talking about most government sort of in the pre-modern era, there is going to be a pretty high degree of decentralization. It is very difficult to effectively rule a centralized empire. Now, it is done, but especially as your empire grows bigger and bigger, you begin to lose some of that control, and certain provinces become more autonomous, more powerful, and that threatens your position. So, as we've seen with the expansion of the caliphate, we are running into a lot of these typical empire building issues that usually come up.
Thus, after being recalled from his governorship and arrested for withholding from the caliph the spoils of war from his difficult-to-Baristan campaign during Suleiman's reign, Yazid ibn al-Mahalib opted to escape prison with his family's aid in 720 and returned to Iraq as Umar lay sickly and dying, rather than trusting himself to the mercies of the coming regime. Umar's death in the same year brought Yazid ibn Abd al-Malik to the throne as Caliph Yazid II. Thus, the all-too-short years of peace under Umar were brought to an end, as Yazid was immediately forced to contend with a Mahalabid rebellion in Iraq. However, not all challenges to the caliphate would be as open or as blatant as those of the Mahalabids. It was during these same few years that Muhammad ibn Ali ibn Abdallah ibn Abbas, the patriarch of another important family based in Khorasan, first began to spread anti-Umayyad propaganda and build a network of support around a demand for rule by blood relatives of the Prophet. And while his and his family's efforts on such a
keep an eye on this family, huh?
distant frontier attracted little attention from the Umayyads in Damascus at the time, the name Abbasid would soon be known throughout every corner of the caliphate.
Oh yeah. Well, we've been talking for a couple episodes about the overextension of the Umayyad Caliphate, how of course, it's expanded very rapidly and impressively, but it is struggling to control its own territory. And now we are sort of getting into, well, we are truly getting into their decline as their authority starts to crumble, and now we get the Abbasids, right? Still pretty early. We do have a bit to go, but this is sort of the phase of the caliphate that we're in now. Decline of the Umayyads, rise of the Abbasids.
The new caliph would take no half measures against Ibn al-Mughalib upon learning of his escape and subsequent refusal to swear fealty. And even before any armies had met in battle, he took steps to undermine the influence of the Mughalibid family. 3 brothers of the rebellious former governor were arrested and imprisoned, despite having not directly participated in their brothers' acts of defiance, deepening the rift. Meanwhile, Yazid ibn al-Mughalib travelled as fast as he could to Basra, where other relatives of his were among the prominent nobility and joined their own forces to his to create a formidable army. This began a standoff with the local forces in Basra, with the Mughalibids demanding the release of their imprisoned kin and spreading bribes among the defending soldiers in Basra to weaken the defenders' resolve and attract more support in their opposition to the caliph.
Nice.
The dwindling defenders under Adi ibn Attat attempted to hold the city.
No loyalty these days, honestly. Well, we've kind of been seeing that for a bit, but loyalty is bought and sold, bought and paid for at this point. Especially when you have this sort of infighting, it does feel like that loyalty, or even sort of just faith in the government, has greatly declined.
But were defeated piecemeal, with part of the army splitting from the main body to hold the city's western caravan quarter. Though whether this was due to a breakdown of authority among the demoralized defenders, or a poor strategic decision on Attat's part, this force would be attacked and routed from the city before the main confrontation began. The remaining defenders eventually rode out from the fortress to engage the Mughalibid besieging force in a nearby cemetery. But despite the staunch core of Syrian horsemen bolstering the local forces, they were soon defeated as well, with the rebels pushing past them in the confusion of their defeat to seize the fortress, capturing Basra and rescuing Yazid ibn al-Mughalib's imprisoned brothers. Though Caliph Yazid II's reign had barely begun, he already faced a serious challenge to his rule.
Yeah, well, he's gonna have to take serious action now, because by imprisoning the brothers, sure, he's trying to take this decisive move to protect his own position, but as they pointed out, he has deepened the rift that was already there, so now he's really gonna have to take some decisive action, or he's in serious jeopardy.
Sparing Adi ibn Attat, the victorious rebel began appointing his own governors in the territories around Basra, while tribal leaders and army commanders loyal to the caliphate fled to Kufa and Syria. Interestingly, it seems the conflict very nearly reached a peaceful conclusion at this point.
Really?
One of these retreating tribal leaders, al-Hawari ibn Ziyad, came across 2 messengers from the caliph escorting Yazid ibn al-Mughalib's nephew and a generous peace offer. The new caliph apparently valuing stability over any family feud, and willing to return Ibn al-Mughalib's relatives and governorship. However, Ibn Ziyad argued against this, informing the messengers of Attat's defeat, and insisting Ibn al-Mughalib could not be trusted, convincing them to turn back.
Yeah, I mean, that honestly might be true. I understand the idea of, look, we'll send a big bribe, we'll send the family members back, give him back his governorship. Sure, you're trying to secure stability for your empire. That does make a lot of sense. I mean, if you enter into a full civil war, you know, your territory will eat itself alive. But if you give all those concessions, well, you're going to grow weaker and weaker, and this governor who you've given back his position is going to grow stronger and stronger and stronger, so unless you have some really intelligent move planned for the future in order to negate those consequences, I don't know if that's the best move to make.
Ibn Ziyad's own family rivalry with the Mughalibids may have played into his actions, as Ibn al-Mughalib's nephew, Humayd, suggested in his pleas to the messengers to continue on to his uncle. But whatever his reasons, he ensured through a few words that the civil strife would continue. However, despite Caliph Yazid's reluctance to do battle, the advantage was nevertheless his. While the Mughalibids had secured the support of most of the tribes and army commanders in Basra, Aided by lingering resentment towards the caliphate lasting since the tyrannical reign of al-Hajjaj, they had been too slow to seize control in Kufa before its reinforcement, despite the prominent places many members of the dynasty had held in the region. Thus, after some skirmishing against General Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik that saw the Euphrates crossed and the Al Jazeera region retaken by Umayyad forces, Ibn al-Mahalab left Basra with its treasury in hand, intending to march to Kufa. An advance party of Maslama's army...
Yeah, I mean, from what we've seen so far in this series, Basra is an important city, and Kufa is very important if you want to have this sort of regional center of power in this area.
Sabotaged the canals south of Kufa, however, creating a flood that cut the Mahalabid army off from their destination, as well as from any possible reinforcement from Kufan supporters and family members, and leaving them stranded near Karbala in August 720, where Maslama's main force would catch them on August 17th. An initial engagement set the tone of the battle, with an advance force near Yazid's brother Abd al-Malik ibn al-Mahalib initially driving back the Umayyads' own advance party under al-Abbas ibn al-Walid and nearly claiming victory, only to be routed when the Syrians managed to rally and regroup with the bank of the Euphrates at their backs. Abd al-Malik would regroup with the rest of the army, digging trenches to fortify their camp next to a bridge across the Euphrates, and stationing part of the army on the opposite bank to protect a line of retreat. However, these precautions would not save the Mahalabid rebellion when the battle was finally joined.
Wow.
According to the sometimes unreliable testimony of the historian Abu McNaf, Yazid ibn al-Mahalib favored a night attack on the Umayyad camp to fill in the Umayyads' own trenches under the cover of darkness and prepare for a decisive assault at daybreak, but was overruled by the chiefs and leaders among his army, who insisted they abide by the terms of honorable combat under the Quran they had agreed upon with the Umayyads prior. Yazid disagreed, claiming the Umayyads were unlikely to show the same chivalry. This odd episode is likely colored by Abu McNaf's anti-Umayyad biases.
Interesting. I mean, that also seems like a bit of post-facto moralization. Very typical for historians. Well, really historians before the modern era, before the professionalization of history to do things like that. I think of Roman historians mostly, because that's what I'm more familiar with. But these historians, sure, they were, in one sense, doing what historians do today. And historians today craft narratives, but they were really focused on the narrative crafting back then. And if they could include a story, or they could moralize a little bit, even if maybe they just heard a rumor about it, or maybe it was entirely untrue, they might include something like that. They might make up a conversation. You know, what might of these historical figures have said at that time, right? So a lot of our historians have been quite unreliable for a lot of history, frankly.
But the battle itself bore out his supposed warning, with the Umayyads opening the full-scale battle on August 25th by sending a force in small boats to set the bridge ablaze and divide the Mahalabid army. On top of cutting off a line of retreat and stranding some of Yazid's forces on the opposite side of the river from the battle, the torching of the bridge was already enough on its own to cause many of Yazid's questionably dedicated soldiers to...
And like I said, there's no loyalty these days. That applies to the Caliph and his men. We saw they could be bought off, but that also applies to our friend here. Loyalty is not very strong. People move with the wind. Whichever way the momentum is going, that's the direction these soldiers are going, in many cases.
Break and attempt to flee, only to be rounded up and beheaded as an example on their own commander's orders, leaving the Mahalabid ranks in chaos before the first blows were even traded.
I mean, that's a way to make a point. And I understand the point being made. You were trying to enforce that discipline. Maybe not the best move in the middle of a battle. However, would letting your men run away in the middle of a battle be the best move? No. Either way, a lot of chaos is going to be caused. Not a great thing to happen.
To blow would be the death of Yazid's brother, Habib, who commanded the Mahalabid right flank, and perished early in the battle. The death of his brother, combined with the other setbacks and pressing defeat, seemed to have unbalanced the elderly Mahalabid leader, whose words and behavior following are marked with a single-mindedness bordering on madness.
Oh.
Dismissing advice to retreat to Wesit, he pressed on with the remains of his wavering forces, charging straight for the Umayyad center, where Maslama was camped, with little care for maneuver or nuance.
Yeah, it seems like the rest of your army is getting whooped currently. They are being significantly pushed back, and in a single-minded, I don't know what it is, fury, determination, whatever, you have gone straight from Maslama, who is sort of sitting pretty out in the back. He's got his own camp. I very much doubt you'll be able to break through, and you're letting your own army fall apart. So, seems like the decision-making sort of fell away, perhaps after his brother died, or maybe when he saw the battle was being lost, I don't know.
The greater Umayyad numbers, and Yazid's seeming death wish, made the outcome of the battle certain. Yazid and his companions clashed with Syrian cavalry until their defeat, with a warrior named Al-Kal ibn al-Ayash fighting his way to Yazid, whereupon the two men dealt each other fatal blows.
Oh, wow.
Another of Yazid's brothers, Al-Mufaddal, commanded the left wing with more skill and discipline, and even saw some success after the routing of the rest of the army. But when news reached him of the deaths of his brothers and the flight of his allies, he fled the battlefield, the decisive battle ending whatever threat the Mohallabids posed. The immediate aftermath of the rebellion was nearly as bloody as the battle that preceded it,
Really?
with both sides vengefully executing whatever prisoners they had, including Adi ibn Attat in Basra and numerous members of the Mohallabid family that had been arrested at the rebellion's inception.
Yeah, these civil wars are messy, man, and they seem to become more messy over time, more intense. You know, there's less mercy. People, yeah, they are not ready to forgive and forget, I'll put it that way. These wars are getting more and more brutal, perhaps as more and more chaos enters the Umayyad Caliphate. So the Mohallabid rebellion seemed pretty promising in the beginning, very threatening to the position of the Caliph, but ultimately sort of fell apart. Maybe seems like they didn't necessarily act decisively enough when it came to Kufa, and then this battle just did not go their way. Some terrible decision-making in the end. Perhaps the rebellion could have been extended, but that's not what happened.
While Maslama, taking over as governor of Iraq, pursued the fleeing Al-Mufaddal and other prominent rebels to Fars, where they were finally slain. Though quite large in scale, this rebellion was fairly short-lived, and its impact on history would likely not have been great if not for the previously mentioned Abbasids building support for their own ambitions. With the power of the Mohallabid family broken, its loyalists and more distant kinsmen, not caught in the purge, pledged their still respectable power to the Abbasids, and the family would return to prominence in later decades as vassals to another caliphate. Thus, this rebellion is somewhat more significant as one of the several leading into the third fitna. The Umayyad victory only bolstered the strength of tomorrow's enemies.
Interesting. Yeah, because on its face, that was a rebellion that didn't appear that different from many that we've seen before. You know, seemed pretty promising in the beginning, gathered a lot of power, but then rather quickly fell apart, crumbled, didn't have much of an impact. But since, like I said, we were in this era, the fall of the Umayyads, the rise of the Abbasids, this was a contributing factor to the rise of the Abbasids and one of the building blocks towards the Abbasid takeover. That is very noteworthy, and we can see the Abbasids all the way in the eastern portion of the empire, you know, sort of gathering power over time, building up, and, you know, in a bit, it'll still take them some years, some decades, but they will be the ones truly in control of everything.
For now, though, as the Abbasids bide their time and the deteriorating Arab possession in Transoxiana sees fighting rock Samarkand, our attention returns to Al-Andalus and southern France.
Back to Western Europe.
The previous...
I always think this is a very interesting spot. I think looking at sort of the edges of the Caliphate is fascinating because it always presents you with a what if. You know, when they fought with China in Tibet, well, what if they had won and continued expanding? What would have happened? This is another what if. You know, we've sort of reached the extent of Al-Andalus. what if the caliphate had kept expanding, going further into Europe? I mean, there's a lot of questions. What if they had conquered Constantinople, continued to move into Europe from that direction? There's a lot of questions you could ask yourself about, because the caliphate was expanding so rapidly at this point. You could really look at any of its borders and ask yourself, well, what if they had continued to expand further? And while it may be unlikely, not impossible given all the expansion we've seen so far, and they're definitely gonna make an effort, so I think that sort of stuff is pretty interesting.
Previously mentioned Andalusian governor Al-Sam ibn Malik, now more secure in his new holdings and reforms, chose in early 721 to continue the conquests of the Umayyads further northwards into the lands of the Franks, gathering an impressive army, likely 10,000 to 15,000 strong, even if the 6-digit figures given in Frankish accounts are dismissed. On top of bringing further prizes and revenues for himself and the Caliph by his conquests, Al-Sam seems to have rushed into further outward expansion, in part to keep the fragile harmony within Al-Andalus, hoping the Arab and Berber soldiers and settlers so recently at each other's throats could come together for plunder and holy war in France, rather than returning to their infighting at home. Narbonne was established and provisioned as the forward base from which the campaign would be launched, while to the north, Duke Odo of Aquitaine gathered forces of his own and sent out calls for aid. Though the exact date of his advance into Francia is unclear, it coincidentally seems to have taken place very shortly after the death of the Frankish king Chilperic II, leaving Francia technically under the rule of Theuderic IV, an 8-year-old boy. However, this was far less significant than it might sound. Real power was held by the steward, Charles Martel, who held the rather odd title of mayor over all the Frankish kingdoms.
I believe they were called, mayors of the palace. These, the men behind the throne, who would soon become the men in front of the throne, were the people who had the real power. Charles Martel, in particular, is someone of great prominence.
After his victory in a many-sided struggle that had started as a civil war for Charles's native Austrasia. When Chilperic, then king of Neustria, had attempted to take advantage of the chaos and jointly invaded with King Radbod of Frisia, their opportunism backfired, with Charles eventually defeating not only his Austrasian rival, Plectrude, and the invaders, but also the previously mentioned Odo, who briefly joined Chilperic as an ally once the Neustrian king's war was a defensive one. Finally betrayed by Odo and delivered into Charles's hands, Chilperic surrendered most of his authority to Charles, being elevated to become king of all the Franks in name, but in truth serving as nothing more than a puppet, less than 3 years earlier in 718.
And we talked about some of this in our video on the Battle of Tours, which is another very prominent battle in sort of this Muslim expansion into Western Europe, this Muslim expansion into France. A little bit later than this, we're actually kind of seeing the build-up to that. But yeah, Charles Martel, very prominent character, these mayors of the palace, the true power behind the throne. And when we talk about Charles Martel, I mean, he's important in his own right, absolutely, building his base of power, building up his empire, but, we don't have too long to go. I think it's, 2 successors until we get to Charlemagne. We're talking about this period of history, and we're now building up to Charlemagne, who, of course, everybody knows, and is particularly important. Though that is sort of a whole other thread of history that is not entirely relevant to this, but, you can see the connections, right?
Chilperic's passing and the crowning of Theuderic by Charles removed any lingering internal threat to the steward's power, and allowed him to consolidate his hard-won position. But despite this new security, Charles would not be coming to answer his former enemy Odo's call for reinforcement. Though Charles Martel would become famous throughout Europe for his later efforts against the Moors, at this point, his efforts were still focused on fighting the invading Saxons, and it's likely that seeing his powerful and functionally independent Aquitanian vassal weakened was to his benefit as well. Odo would thus be forced to stand alone against Al-Sam's invasion, though he would prove himself far from helpless. Initially unopposed as they left Narbonne in spring, the Arab and Berber force arrived at Aquitaine's largest city of Toulouse in early March of 721, their momentum halting as they settled in for a siege, but with the advantage seemingly still on their side. But the 3 months the cavalry-heavy Muslim army spent waiting outside the walls of Toulouse robbed them of the advantages in speed and mobility that had allowed such rapid conquests in Spain.
Yeah, though it's interesting when we look at both sides here and sort of look at the different motivations. On the Frankish side of things, of course, they're protecting their homeland. We also see an effort to build up their own bases of power. That's particularly true in the case of Charles Martel, because he's the one who has already come out on top and will remain on top, right? He's building his own base of power, he's protecting his territory, but even in the case of Odo or something like this, they're all trying to build out their own power base and trying to defend their territory. Whereas when we look at the Muslim forces, as we talked about, this is, on one hand, a bit of a sort of unifying mission. Why don't we stop infighting and why don't we try and fight the Franks instead? Bring us together, we can do that. This is an expansion of their power, not necessarily quite yet an expansion of their territory, but an expansion of Muslim power from Al-Andalus further into Europe. Also, it's my understanding that there were some monetary incentives as well. These Muslim forces wanted to raid into France, loot these cities. Apparently there was quite a bit of wealth to be gained, so I think that was a big part of it as well, to my understanding.
And it seems Al-Sam may have allowed himself to become complacent, while Odo assembled his army of perhaps 8,000 to 12,000 soldiers,
Wow.
not expecting significant resistance after his string of easy victories against the remnants of the Visigoths. In an apparent failure of scouting, despite his access to thousands of skilled horsemen,
Yeah,
Al-Sam allowed...
that appears to be quite a failure of scouting, huh? First of all, Odo has raised far more men than you might have expected. Now, maybe you're saying, well, 8,000, 10,000, those don't seem like massive numbers. In this region, in this era, those are pretty big numbers. And he is now surrounding the Muslim force, so that is, quite the failure of scouting, I would say.
Odo's army to march south of Toulouse by the beginning of June, cutting the Muslims off from Narbonne and trapping them between the field army and the besieged city's garrison. As with so many other battles turned into myths to glorify a religious victory,
Right.
the exact events of the battle that erupted on June 9th.
And we get a lot of that here, and we always get that sort of thing with, like, Muslim versus Christian conflict. There's this idea of, like, the clash of civilizations. I would say always be skeptical of these grand historical narratives. History is always more complicated than that. It's always more granular. There's a million different things going on. You cannot characterize something like this with just this one big narrative of, yes, Islam versus Christianity and the sacred battle. No, that's way too simple for my taste. This in particular is often characterized by that, sort of the Muslim incursions into France, the Battle of Tours, the Battle of Toulouse. People often talk about it in that way. Which, obviously, there's a religious element to it, right? And they knew it at the time. I'm not trying to deny that. But I think oftentimes accuracy can be lost when we're framing it exclusively in that way. So I'm just saying, whenever you hear grand historical narratives or dogma or whatever, always be skeptical, always dig a little deeper. Because, of course, these narratives can be present even in the primary sources of the era or in secondary sources afterwards. You always need to try and, find what accurate, truth, as objective as possible information you can find.
Are difficult to pin down, with both sides claiming absurdly inflated army sizes in excess of 300,000 for their enemy.
Yeah, that's more than exaggerating. That's insane. We're talking about forces, roughly sort of 10,000 strong. Maybe like 8,000, 10,000, 15,000. This is the range we're talking about. To exaggerate, you'd say, they had like 20,000, 30,000. That would be an exaggeration. To go anywhere near the six figures, they had 100,000 plus, that's just insane.
What is clear is that after a skillful encirclement of the besieging Muslim force by Odo, the defenders of Toulouse took a bold risk in sallying forth to join the battle in the field.
I mean, very bold, very risky, but, high risk, high reward, right?
To their credit, the Muslims did not quickly break or rout, despite their disadvantage, and the simmering distrust still felt by many along the Arab-Berber divide. Rallying around Al-Sam, they fought a dogged last stand, even after their leader's mortal injury, and after hours of fighting, a portion of the army even managed to break the encirclement and escape to Narbonne with the injured governor. With their mobility advantage nullified and enemies on all sides, though, this brave stand did little to change the inevitable outcome, and the majority of the Muslim invasion force was either taken prisoner and ransomed or perished in battle on the bloody fields outside Toulouse, while Al-Sam succumbed to his wounds in Narbonne not long after. This would not be the last attempt of the Umayyads to invade France.
No.
But Toulouse was nothing less than a disaster for the Umayyads, particularly with the dangers posed by a revanchist rival kingdom so close to home. The recently founded Kingdom of Asturias, ignored for their defensible terrain and comparative poverty in favor of more lucrative targets in France, would win its own first victory against the conquering Umayyads the following year at Covadonga, a relatively small-scale but historically significant skirmish marked by many today as the beginning of the Reconquista, which we will cover in a...
It's crazy that I always think of the Reconquista starting later, but in reality, it's just the Reconquista lasted a long time. It sort of gets kicked off very early, like we're talking almost immediately after the Muslim conquest. The Christian reconquest kicks off, but just takes a long time for this process to be completed.
Separate series. These developments, together with the growing...
A separate series on Reconquista. That could be interesting. I really don't know much about that, but it's a fascinating topic.
Power of the Abbasids in Khorasan represented many pivotal events and transformations in their infancy, and the dawn of a new era just around the corner as the sun began to set on the Umayyads. Our series on early Islamic history will continue, so to ensure you don't miss that, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely.
Alright, and I'd appreciate it if you could do the same on this video. Okay, another interesting episode in the early Muslim expansion series by Kings and Generals. I've always enjoyed this series, of course, it's slowed down for a while now, the last couple of months. If we backtrack a little bit, I was doing a lot of these reactions, but it's because we caught up to where they were, and so now I just react whenever they release a new one, but I always enjoy them. They're always very interesting. It's often new territory for me. Some of the stuff today was actually familiar because ever since these reactions sort of slowed down, we've done some more stuff on the Abbasid Caliphate or, Muslim incursions into France. So some of the stuff we have actually covered a little bit, especially the rise of the Abbasids. But still, a lot of the details I am unfamiliar with. So, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, like I said, leave a like, subscribe, all that good stuff. I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.